All right, good morning, everyone. Looks like we have a good group so far. I'm Andrew Johnson, and I'm an analyst with the Building Performance Standards team at the Oregon Department of Energy. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the proposed CERTA BPS incentive program. A few words about WebEx. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can raise your hand under reactions at the bottom of the screen or next to your name in the participants list. For those of you on the phone, you can use *3 to raise your hand. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment in the chat, you can find the chat window in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And if you'd like to enable closed captions, you can do so by clicking on the CC in a word bubble in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. Before you ask a question or provide a comment, please note your name and organization. Also, we ask that you hold your questions and comments until the feedback period at the end of the meeting. Please limit your questions and comments to the CERTA BPS incentive program. Does anyone have any questions about using WebEx before we begin? You can put any questions in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, very good. And just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded to maintain a permanent record. Here's an overview of the agenda for this morning. In a moment, we'll have ODO staff introduce themselves. After ODO staff introductions, we will briefly review the building performance standard. We'll spend most of our time here, probably about 15 to 20 minutes, reviewing the proposed incentive program, and then we'll open it up for stakeholder feedback and general questions and comments. While we're introducing ourselves, advisory committee members, please introduce yourselves by putting your name and organization in the chat. So again, I'm Andrew Johnson, an analyst with the BPS team at the Oregon Department of Energy, and I will kick it over to Blake.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'm Blake Shalide, manager of the Codes and Standards section at ODO, and I'll let Judy introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Judy, and I am the public service representative for Codes and Standards, and I'll kick it on over to Madeline.
Hi, I'm Madeline O'Dwyer. I'm a policy analyst that works with Blake and the rest here in Codes and Standards. And I think Jennifer might be the last ODO on the call.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer, the division assistant. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you all. Just a little bit about the Oregon Building Performance Standard. I know many of you have been involved in the program. So this will be review for many of you. In 2023, the Oregon legislature passed House Bill 3409, establishing a BPS for commercial buildings. The BPS addresses energy use and emissions from existing commercial buildings in Oregon. And the BPS requires certain commercial buildings to enhance energy management practices and implement efficiency measures to meet energy use targets. In order to be subject to the BPS, the building must be considered a covered building. Covered buildings are broken into two different categories, Tier 1 and Tier 2. Non-residential buildings, hotels and motels over 35,000 square feet are considered Tier 1. And non-residential buildings, hotels and motels over 20,000 square feet up to 35,000 square feet, and multifamily residential buildings, hospitals, schools, dorms, and university buildings over 35,000 square feet are considered Tier 2. Any buildings that aren't in either of these categories, Tier 1 or Tier 2, are considered not covered and not subject to the BPS. Many of you might already know that we actually have two incentive programs running kind of concurrently. We have a state-funded program, and that's a $2 million program that came out of HB 3409, and we have the federally funded program, the $12 million from CERTA that we're discussing here today. I just wanted to compare the two very quickly. We're not going to get into the state-funded program here, but just for comparison's sake, the state-funded program incentivizes early compliance. Incentives are for planning activities required for compliance. Tier 1 and Tier 2 buildings are eligible. The incentive is up to 85 cents per square foot with caps. Incentive awards are competitive, and we plan 2 funding rounds, $1 million each round. Our first funding round is starting in a few weeks here, probably mid-September. And the federally funded program, the $12 million from CERTA, and I'll talk about CERTA here in a minute, incentivizes early compliance and exceeding compliance. Incentives are for energy efficiency measures that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Tier 1, Tier 2, and tribal buildings are eligible. The incentive is $120 per metric ton of greenhouse gases reduced. Incentive awards are competitive, similar to the state-funded program, and we plan 2 to 3 funding rounds, depending on how much available funding we have. So you've heard me mention CERTA. ODO was awarded $12 million in federal funding for BPS incentives as part of the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's Climate Equity and Resilience Through Action program. CERTA, Climate Equity and Resilience Through Action, is CERTA. CERTA is a program that is managed by the DEQ. It's part of a larger grant that the Oregon DEQ received, the $12 million for BPS incentives is just one program of various programs that other agencies in Oregon are managing. Some key dates for the CERTA BPS incentive program. We plan to begin round 1 in the fall of this year, round 2 in the spring of 2026, and round 3, if necessary, in the fall of 2026. And as I mentioned, round 1 for the state-funded program will begin here in a few weeks. So for the CERTA BPS incentive program, the building must be a Tier 1 or Tier 2 covered building to be eligible. Must be a tribal owner of a building with similar size and building activity type as a Tier 1 or Tier 2 covered building. Must have a baseline energy use intensity that exceeds the energy use intensity target. And incentives must be used for energy efficiency measures, EEMs, such as HVAC or lighting. To receive an incentive, a building must install energy efficiency measures to achieve compliance before the compliance date. In other words, the building must reduce the EUI at or below the EUI target, or demonstrate that the energy efficiency measures have been completed that will result in performance that is better than the building's EUI target after the compliance date. And all incentives must be claimed or requested by June 1st, 2028. The incentive amounts are $120 per metric ton of greenhouse gases reduced for the lifetime of the project or projects. This is different than the state-funded program, which incentivizes based on square footage of the building. Maximum incentives, $100,000 for Tier 1 and $50,000 for Tier 2 and Tribal. And before we start accepting applications, we will post the opportunity announcement, which will include guidance for greenhouse gas reduction calculations, including emissions factors and measure lifetimes. Here is an example of the incentive calculation and how we plan to calculate the incentive in greenhouse gas reduction. So you'll see at the top that short green bar from 2027 to 2028. The building owner will be paid for the greenhouse gas reduction from achieving compliance up to the compliance date. So assuming that the owner met their compliance and hit their EUI target exactly, they would be paid for that greenhouse gas reduction over that early compliance period up to the compliance date. And then I mentioned incentivizing exceeding compliance as well. In addition to that early compliance incentive, the building owner will be paid an incentive for exceeding compliance for the life of the project. So you can see that long, more narrow green bar. As I mentioned, applications will be available in fall 2025. And the opportunity announcement will be shared before the application window opens with guidance for greenhouse gas calculations, evaluation criteria, and how each is scored. This is similar to the state-funded program. Applications will be fillable PDF documents requesting general building owner information and incentive amount requested, building EUI, EUIT, and evidence of owner's Energy Star Portfolio Manager account, and a completed Level 2 energy audit with decarbonization assessment, including the proposed EEMs, cost of EEMs, and estimated energy savings and greenhouse gas reductions performed by a qualified energy auditor. As I mentioned, the department will conduct a competitive review of all submitted applications. Due to the limited funding, we decided this was the best way to award incentives and also to spread the funding around as much as possible to those who need it most. Priority will be given to estimated energy savings and greenhouse gas reductions from EEMs, strength of the project plan, and similar to the state-funded program, buildings located in a rural area, multifamily residential buildings, and affordable housing. So after we receive all of the applications and the application window closes, we'll begin the application review. Buildings will be evaluated and assigned a score. Owners will receive written notice within 30 days after the application period closes, and owners that have been awarded an incentive will have 30 days to accept the terms of the performance agreement. To receive an incentive, building owners must submit Part 2 of the application and provide evidence that the EEMs have been completed for the compliance date, and this is similar to the state-funded program. So we'll have a Part 1 application and a Part 2 application. And then lastly, we will conduct some site audits. We plan to inspect a small percentage of the projects to confirm that the projects have been completed. And we are at 11:15. Must be talking really fast because we're done with the presentation. And so I'd like to open it up for feedback. Advisory committee members, if you have a question or comment, please raise your hand. Once we are done receiving feedback from our advisory committee members, we'll open it up to the rest of the participants in the meeting. And I think Jen, if you could, Jen or Judy, if you could make sure that we're keeping an eye on those raised hands. Do we have any comments? The purpose of this meeting is to, is really to get feedback from our stakeholders. Let us know if you have concerns about how the program is designed. If you have any comments about how this could be designed better, or just any general questions or concerns about the program.
I saw Kathleen raise her hand first.
Yeah, thank you. This is Kathleen Belkaya with Energy Trust of Oregon. Do you have a deadline yet on the first round application, like when that closes?
That's a great question. So it will probably be similar to the state-funded program, where we have a 45-day application window. So it will probably be something similar to that in the 40, well, I would say in the 30 to 60-day range. We need to get some feedback from folks on what what a reasonable time period would be. And we don't want to leave the application window open for too long, obviously, but we also want to give folks enough time to complete their energy audits and get their applications completed.
So 45 days from when it launches in the fall?
Yeah. So if we say we start the program in on November 1st, the application window would close, in mid-January or mid to late January. Does that make sense? And then, so yeah, and then once the application window closes, we will collect all the applications and start our competitive review.
So just a follow-up then. So would the expectation be that folks would kind of be on top of this and be implementing their projects prior to the application or the round one application opening? Because it would take quite a while to get an audit done, measures implemented, and then the application.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So the incentives will be based on the expected greenhouse gas emissions reductions based on the part one of the application. So the energy audit will show the expected greenhouse gas emissions reductions based on the completed energy efficiency measures, and we will estimate the incentive based on that. So the projects won't need to be completed during the application window period. I think that's what you're asking. So,
well, I guess I'm talking more about kind of the installation of measure. I mean, just the process of getting the audit done, calculation of incentives.
Yeah.
Or, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
of the savings.
Yes. Yeah.
And then the
That's
installation.
why I get it. That's why I mentioned, we're taking feedback on how long that application window should be, because we realize that energy audits can take some time.
Well, I mean, it's not just that, it's the installation, right? Because they have to have installed the measures.
No, they won't need to be installed during the application, before they submit the application. Submit the application based on the energy audit. The incentive will be paid based on the expected savings or greenhouse gas reductions. So you submit your application with the energy audit. We have a number there. Okay, it will equal the equivalent of $20,000 in greenhouse gas reductions. That would be the incentive. Then you go install your energy efficiency measures and submit. When you're done, before the compliance date, you submit your part 2 of the application showing that you completed the energy efficiency measures, and we would pay you that incentive.
Okay, thank you.
Did that make sense? Yeah, sorry, that wasn't very clear in the presentation, but I'm glad you brought that up.
Thanks for clarifying.
Mm-hmm.
I saw Sky also raise his hand.
Thanks, Jennifer. Back on slide 14, I think the priorities given are good. Is there any, or maybe I'm not seeing how, like the equity, particularly the minorities and underserved communities are included in the prioritization?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are trying to address that concern, I would say indirectly by prioritizing rural communities, multifamily housing, and affordable housing. But if you have other ideas, please let us know. We're open to prioritizing other communities, underserved communities. But we think that with those three, we do touch on many of the underserved communities. You know, we want to make sure that we're you know, we're hitting all corners of the state. So the rural priority, I think, would you know, help with spreading some of this funding around to Eastern Oregon and outside the Willamette Valley, and then of course, you know, the multifamily and affordable housing. Those are kind of linked a little bit, but address somewhat different things.
Good proxies. Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
I also saw Vin raise his hand.
Hi, thanks, Vin Mason, the city of Portland. I just real quick, I do think 45 days sounds pretty tight for a level 2 energy audit and getting the results and applying for the application too, and just kind of coordinating all that.
Yeah.
If you're seeking to, you know, prioritize rural and multifamily affordable housing, those systems just might need a little more time to prepare. Maybe it's just more time before the announcement actually is made and outreach to them, so they know that it's coming. But my question is thinking about tier 1 and tier 2 BPS requirements. So as I understand, the state $2 million incentives for that program, for tier 2, it's just for benchmarking to meet the state requirements. But would this be a wholly separate incentive then for multifamily to actually make improvements that relate to the BPS, in that there's an EUI target that would need to be met? Are there any other of the tier 1 requirements that would also need to be met for a tier 2 building to actually receive the incentive?
That's a great question. So, and Blake, you can chime in if you want to add to my answer. But so in order to receive the incentive for the CERTA program, the building must demonstrate an EUI that's at or below their EUI target. That's the main threshold for this program. In terms of totally achieving compliance, and I think you're asking that if the building owner would need to demonstrate compliance beyond just meeting their EUI target. Is that correct for
Yeah,
this
tier 1
program?
compliance. If a tier 2 building would need to
Yeah.
use some components of tier 1 compliance.
Right. So I think maybe Blake, you can address that if we need to, in order, and we're just talking about strictly about the incentive requirements, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So,
Yeah, so I think a tier 2 building would just need to start out with an EUI that's worse than its target, and it would get an incentive for any any compliance that exceeds its target, based on the greenhouse gas reductions, but it wouldn't necessarily need to do any other tier 1 based compliance. It's not, is that your question, Ben? Like if it's then going to kick it into like tier 1 status?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Or if
No.
any of the tier 1 compliance components would be used to determine whether or not the part 2 of the application is complete to actually receive the incentive.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it will need to do like an energy audit, which is in some cases required for tier 1 compliance, but that's really just to demonstrate the energy savings and the greenhouse gas savings that we use to calculate the incentive amount. But the other components of tier 1 compliance, like an energy management plan, operations and management plan, wouldn't be required for those tier 2 buildings to receive an incentive.
Okay, and then a little bit of follow-up question that's a bit in the weeds, that maybe too in the weeds, but something that I'm deeply involved in right now at the city is utility-specific emission factors. I know that tier 1 and tier 2 buildings will be using those for compliance with the BPS standards versus the portfolio manager e-grid factors. And so is that also something that would be, it sounds like portfolio manager EUI needs to be, and maybe greenhouse gas emissions might be in the application, the first application. Would that be using just the e-grid factor and portfolio manager, or would they need to adjust to their utility?
Yeah, we plan to specify the factors that would need to be used for that energy audit with decarbonization assessment that would need to come with the application, and they would not use the e-grid factors. They would use more specific Oregon utility emissions factors.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I also saw Adam's hand up.
Hi, Adam Holshoe, Portland Community College. Yeah, just kind of looking at the qualifications that a building has to be above its current EUI target, and then after the implementation be below the EUI target might limit, buildings that are even qualified. There's, kind of a small range of, these kind of energy efficiency measures. Like when they get implemented, they're not going to for like a tier 2 building, because I'm thinking about that because that's what all of my buildings are. A $50,000 measure isn't going to really improve the energy efficiency all that much. It'll improve absolutely a number of points, but if that window is, even if it's a 10 point swing in EUI, that's a pretty narrow window of buildings that would qualify, both before and after.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just kind of seeing that as a potential barrier for, excluding some of the worst buildings, because if it has a terrible EUI, maybe it's a lab building that it's bringing in a ton of outside air. Yeah, there's measures that can improve that. Is it going to get it below the EUI target? No. Well, then it's out of this program. So I think these requirements might be just kind of funneling the money to the buildings that are the best performers, because those are the ones that are going to be able to go from slightly above to below their EUI targets with a limited investment.
Right, yeah, that's a good point. And we'll have to see, how the first round goes. I'm not sure that will necessarily be the case, but we'll see. Part of the point of having multiple rounds here is so that we can collect some data from the first round and then adjust as necessary for the second round. But yeah, you're right. All building owners won't have equal access to this. Some of the higher energy use intensity buildings might not be able to get down to where they want to be at the first shot. But Lisa, did you have anything to add to that? I think you're on mute, Lisa, or I can't hear you.
I think you can hear me now, I hope.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, for tier 2 buildings, they're not required to implement any energy efficiency measures, right? Also, what else was I thinking when this came up? Well, if there are, you may do an audit, you may come up with measures. The measures may not be enough to reduce you below your energy target. We understand that. And that's what the investment criteria is all about for this program. It's like taking that reality into account and saying, hey, we know you may not reach target, but we do want you are required to implement all the cost-effective energy efficiency measures that there are in the program. So I'm not sure how that translates to whether or not you earn incentives, but just for how the program works. We do reflect reality. We know that not all buildings are going to be able to achieve target, even if they install every single cost-effective energy efficiency measure. So rest assured, you're okay. Just, we want you to make the effort. That's the thing.
Oh, and I want to make the effort. I'm just
Right.
looking at, what
Yeah, I appreciate
sources
that.
of money. There, the capital funds and even the operating dollars are not much to put a dent in the square footage that I am currently overseeing.
Sure, but we are looking at, not just some measure that costs $50,000 that isn't going to be, saving. It's cost effectiveness targets. And, the first screening is the simple payback, which would come out of an energy audit. But if you don't feel like that's appropriate, you can do a life cycle cost assessment of those measures as well, or have your auditor do that for you to, to bring in, like, if you're not going to do it right away and you plan to do it down the road, things like that, the cost of money, the cost of the measure, the savings, all of that, and on whatever schedule that you think you can meet. So there's some flexibility there. I just want to reassure you about that. Once again, I don't know how that translates to qualifying for incentives, but that's how the regular part of the program works.
Thank you, Lisa. I also see Michael has his hand up.
Yeah, to kind of echo that same message, based on buildings that we've already worked on, we're seeing quite a few that are well above their targets. And even if they implement their EEMs, they're still not going to be able to meet their target. So they're going to have to go down that investment criteria. So these incentives that are being proposed, like was mentioned, is just not going to help these buildings that need it the worst. And I think that's something that we should reconsider on, developing a different pattern on how to, pan out this money.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Michael, feel free to send us your suggestions for how we might do that. I think it's good to keep in mind that we have limited funding for thousands of eligible buildings around the state. The state funded program is only 2 million. This is 12 million, which seems like it's quite a bit more than the state funded program, but it's nothing compared to the Washington program. And so we're trying to no really, unless you're a small tier 2 building and your EUI target is not that aggressive, you probably won't see the incentive covering, all or, a large majority of the costs of your efficiency measures. But yeah, great comment. And yeah, please send us, we're still in the design phase here. So send us your comments and suggestions and we'll think about them.
I also see Rachel has her hand up.
Hi, yeah, this is Rachel Moss, Central City Concern. I have a couple of questions. I'm thinking about the some clarification on the application period versus the compliance date. So it sounds like there's going to be 3 different rounds of applications. Does the compliance date so depending on which application round you get into, does the compliance date for that shift associated with that or the date that you apply for and are provided a set aside for the incentive? Or if you apply in round 3, does that just mean you have a shorter window in which to complete compliance?
Yeah, that's correct. You would have a shorter window. The compliance dates aren't going to move depending on the round.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess there's a couple things I'm a little concerned about. I guess one is a sort of a question of do you expect that the $120 per metric ton would fully pay for the measures that are being implemented to achieve the EUI targets, or do you expect that these incentive dollars will be packaged with other incentives and other grant sources and other funding sources in order to pay for a whole project to hit its EUI targets? It sort of feels like, based on some of the comments that folks have made already, that there's likely going to be other work beyond what's paid for by this incentive that would be required to hit those EUI targets by the compliance deadline. And if that's the case, I think the window in which you have to implement, right? I'm thinking about, major renovations and like multifamily, and some of the worst performing buildings in our portfolio are older stock, as well as our unreinforced masonry buildings. And those come with a lot of significant code triggers and other kind of threshold requirements that we would have to meet in order to achieve that. So I'm thinking about, like, okay, we want to do fuel switch from a boiler to mini splits and units, right? That's going to require an entire electrical upgrade in this building. And I don't think that this incentive is built to cover the cost of those kind of added those premiums that come with doing energy efficiency work, like unreinforced masonry retrofits. It certainly doesn't cover that, but even electric upgrades that don't necessarily have a greenhouse gas emission reduction component to it, but is necessary in order to achieve the greenhouse gas emission. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of these buildings that are really, really struggling and really have or need to get to their targets are going to have a lot of baseline preservation needs that need to be packaged together with these projects in order to achieve those targets. And so just thinking through both the timeline as well as the cost coverage of those EEMs and the additional triggers. I'm just wondering to what extent that's been considered.
Yeah, Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, Rachel, that's a good point about some of the electrification measures. I mean, we don't endorse or require electrification by any means, but if you choose an energy efficiency measure like a, heat pump water heater, or some kind of mini split, multi-split system, yeah, you may need to do some upgrades of like the electrical panel in the building, or power input to the building. And I think that could be considered part of the cost of that measure if those measures are installed in conjunction with the electrification upgrades. Does that make sense?
It does, except well, maybe I'm a little confused about how the incentive is going to be calculated, because it sounds like it's the incentive based on the GHG reduced, and it's not actually based on the cost of the measure. So
true. I'm just saying when you're calculating measure costs in the program. So and just clarifying how measure costs would be tallied so that we all have a basic understanding of that when we're considering how to set this program up.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess what the point I'm getting is the best bang for your buck for greenhouse gas reductions in order to maximize your incentive is going to be fuel switching, getting gas out of your building. So that is where you're going to have moving from gas to electric, or implementing electric utilities, right? You're going to have you're going to have lower emissions if you have less gas in your building. So that's where your biggest bang for your buck is going to be, and those are going to have higher premiums associated with them in order to achieve those targets. Again, it's up to the building owner kind of how they want to do this. Obviously, the program isn't telling them you must do fuel switching or anything like that. But I think it's by nature of basing it on the greenhouse gas reduction. We're incentivizing measures that are reducing scope 1 emissions, and I think that there's those are going to be, I suspect that those are going to be the more costly ones that are going to have bigger kind of preservation costs or other like code trigger costs are going to be associated with them. I don't know that for sure, but I think that's sort of my question back to the, the committee is like, has this been studied? Have we looked at like any individual buildings to like understand what the real impact of this is going to be, like taking out of conceptual land and putting it into reality? Does that make sense?
Well, I can I speak? Sorry, I don't want to monopolize it, but I do want to say that the program is not based on greenhouse gas emissions per se. It's based on energy use intensity in the buildings. And greenhouse gas emissions, obviously, if you reduce energy use intensity, you hopefully reduce your greenhouse gas emissions as well. And it's just site energy use, not source energy use. So, you know, I mean, I just want to say, and I think that, I don't know, I wasn't around, but I think that was chosen in particular to just say, hey, we are fuel neutral here. We're just trying to reduce energy use at this point. So, you know, you're taking it to a level a little bit further along than the program is. So I understand it, but that's not how the program is set up.
Yeah,
So.
and CERTA specifically requires some sort of greenhouse gas reduction. So like you said, Lisa, you know, the BPS is focused on EUI, and of course we'll get greenhouse gas emissions reductions out of that, but the CERTA incentive program specifically requires that the direct result is greenhouse gas reductions, incentivizing greenhouse gas reductions and reporting how many greenhouse gases we've reduced, how many metric tons of greenhouse gases we've reduced as part of the incentive program. I saw, let's see, some other hands go up. Adam?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the whole, so the incentive is $120 per metric ton of greenhouse gas reduced. And then you had in one of the slides showing that, you know, there was the pre-compliance incentive would be higher, and then post-compliance, it was lower. Could you kind of revisit that and explain the I guess the math behind that slide?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I can bring that up again. Let me bring that slide up again. And while I'm doing that, Blake, do you mind talking about that for a minute?
Yeah, I can add to that a little bit, and the graphic might help illustrate it. But the nature of this bucket of funding as it comes from the federal government is to acquire additional greenhouse gas reductions that would not otherwise be achieved. We can do that in a couple ways through the BPS program. It's either early compliance, so like meeting the target in advance of when it needs to be met. And I'm just thinking of buildings that are complying through their through meeting the energy target pathway. I think there's been some good suggestions here about how to consider the investment criteria pathway there too. And I think that's something we can take back. But so there's kind of two ways to account for additional, like beyond minimum greenhouse gas reductions, either meeting that target early or beating the target after compliance is met. So that's kind of how we've structured the greenhouse gas reductions associated with the incentive, where you get full credit from going from your baseline EUI to the reduced amount before you need to. But then after you need to, we can't incentivize just meeting the target. So we're only incentivizing performance beyond the target. And those are kind of the way, like structured based on the way that the entire grant program is structured to achieve like additional beyond minimum greenhouse gas reductions. So, so like before they comply, you get credit for baseline to reduction. After compliance, necessarily only credit for like minimum compliance levels to the end reduction state. Hopefully that
Okay.
makes sense. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I guess that's the confusion on my part is you have, you know, the baseline EUI and greenhouse gas as kind of the same line. Is you can reduce EUI without changing your greenhouse gas. Like, yes, if you're reducing, you know, usage, it will translate into that. But, you know, if I fuel switched from electric CO2 gas
Mhm.
and reduce, like I could be emitting more greenhouse gases while reducing my EUI.
Yeah, I understand that. And this is one of the difficulties just in translating between our BPS program requirements that are all based on EUI and the grant funding that's all based on greenhouse gas reductions. So in order to demonstrate a greenhouse gas reduction, it would have to do that in order to get an incentive. In some cases, in a lot of cases, they're linear, energy reduction equals greenhouse gas reduction. When it comes to fuel switching, that's not always the case. So, some situations may not be linear, but in order to qualify for an incentive, it would have to have a greenhouse gas reduction associated with that EUI reduction.
Okay, and then just thinking about those lines again of, all right, the EUI targets are set, and that's easy to show, but how does that relate to or do those even relate to the greenhouse gas reduction numbers if I'm trying to calculate an incentive?
I think they do relate, but I think you're right that every project is going to be a little bit unique in terms of what its specific EUI reduction is and what its associated greenhouse gas reduction is. And that's why we're proposing to require that level 2 audit with decarbonization assessment so that it can really flesh out what the EUI changes and what the greenhouse gas reduction is associated with the projects.
I see Ben has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. This does bring me back to the question of the utility specific emission factors and how important that's going to be. And I'm thinking about, like, before somebody goes through their level 2 audit, I think it'd be really important to have the advice to just run it through Portfolio Manager and see where you actually land in your greenhouse gas emissions. Because level 2 audit's kind of expensive. It's a bit to organize, make it happen, select a contractor, get approval from above for whatever property manager is seeking incentive. But just to know, like, well, how much would it be to and then that might help. Thinking about your point earlier, Rachel, that might help folks determine, like, is this even worth pursuing? And specifically thinking about, like, if you ran like a case study for Portland of a Pacific Power multifamily building and a PG multifamily building, that their portfolio manager, I don't think, has an option right now. There is a way to potentially a workaround within portfolio manager, and maybe it's guiding people through that workaround or doing a back end calculation to convert to the utility specific emission factors, which is what we do in Portland for our commercial buildings, energy reporting. But the importance of that would be, like, so if somebody was fuel switching and they're within PG service territory and the emission factor is more similar to eGrid and, like, the region, then you might see a greenhouse gas benefit and reduction. But if their building is within Pacific Power territory, which is still partially coal-based and has a lot of natural gas in it, not much renewables, it's the emission factor is nearly twice as high as PG. You could, then the property manager could see, like, oh, actually, my emissions currently, based on whatever DQ emission factor is currently available, like 2023 currently, they could see, like, oh, my emissions are actually going to go up by fuel switching for 2023, and then know that this is not even worthy of going to a level 2 energy audit. So I would encourage folks to go through that exercise and some explicit instructions on how to get to their actual emissions, or if it doesn't have to be tied to tier 1, tier 2 compliance for BPS, maybe just let them use the eGrid factor to simplify it. And then that takes out of, at least in Portland, the PG versus Pacific Power large discrepancy in emission factors.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, that's some good advice there, and thank you for that. Oh, sorry. Jen, were you gonna?
Yeah, I see Kathleen has also raised her hand up.
Yeah, follow up, kind of some conversations in the chat about audits. There's a comment about only tier 1 buildings requiring the level 2 audit, but I thought the requirement for CERTA was that either, or whether it's a tier 1 or tier 2, if they're applying for incentives, that they need an audit. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and
Yep.
and I guess like my follow-up is why? Like, is that necessary to require a level 2 audit? Can you get is there a way to get verifiable savings in other ways? I mean, we do that in Energy Trust. We have studies or building assessments where we're able to verify and calculate savings without having a level 2 audit. So just curious if there's would be any consideration to modifying that, so it wouldn't be just with the comment about, maybe a potential shortage of building auditors and desire to get kind of a lot at once, how that could be addressed.
It's something to consider. I don't know, Lisa, do you have anything to add to that? I think you're on mute, Lisa.
Sorry, my computer's acting up and I couldn't quite hear
Okay.
the question.
I'll try to summarize for you, Kathleen. So Kathleen's asking, we're requiring that both tier 1 and tier 2 complete a level 2 energy audit for the CERTA incentive program. But that's, that's pretty burdensome for tier 2 building owners, and it might be a little overkill. Is there a way to, is there potential to develop some sort of other tool or requirement for tier 2 buildings to, to be eligible for the incentive program?
If you don't do an audit to begin with, the only, I mean, we really need some kind of way to know what you're installing, how much energy it's supposed to save.
Right. So I guess my question was whether that can be done, that has to be done by doing a level 2 audit. I was just saying at Energy Trust, we assess in other ways. It's not usually a level 2 audit. It could be a study, but it could be also like a lower level audit where they're still calculating the incentive or the savings, and being able to identify, potential savings. So just in terms of cost, cost savings for the customer, and availability of auditors, just whether that could be considered if there was just a criteria that was met for how the assessment or calculations were done, as opposed to requiring it be a level 2 audit.
I don't know. That's something we'll have to consider. But at this point, I can't see changing that. It's kind of baked in. It might even be in the legislation. So, Blake, do you remember if it's in the legislation? We'll just have to think about it as we go forward.
Yeah, and
definitely
talking
take
about
that to
just for
heart.
incentives or for program compliance?
I was just referring to
for the incentives. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know that we'll move away from level 2 requirements for program compliance, but I think the discussions around level 2 audits for incentive,
right. The question was just about the incentives. Yeah.
As you know, Kathleen, tier 2, this would be voluntary compliance for tier 2 buildings. So you're essentially applying for incentives to voluntarily comply with meeting the compliance requirements for tier 2. But I know that there's some, some well-meaning and ambitious tier 2 building owners that want to get ahead of this. So totally understandable. We have 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we are also covering the comments in the chat. I don't know if Jen or Judy have been tracking these, but we can just look through these very quickly. I see do you have a guess for how many buildings will be competing for these incentives? We don't know, to be honest with you, what we'll get. But again, the whole point of having individual rounds is to see how our building owners are reacting to this, and if we need to tweak the program in any way. But great question. Michael, did you have one more quick question? I want to make sure we get to these comments as well. We've got quite a few. But go ahead.
Yeah, so in Washington State, so they have the Tier 2 incentive, which is the O&M benchmarking EMP in order to qualify for that incentive. I put in the chat as an option for potentially considering, but it goes back to how the wording with the federal funding is, could we just require benchmarking for the Tier 2 buildings, and then the incentive funding will pay for the audit. So basically your funding will be for the audit cost. And so that at least these Tier 2 buildings will get their audit done.
Right, you're talking about the incentives for this program?
Yeah, for this program, yeah.
So yeah, that's a great question. So we decided to target planning with the state-funded incentive program. So Tier 2 buildings, I think the assumption is that Tier 2 buildings will apply for incentives for energy benchmarking and reporting in the state-funded incentive program, but they are also eligible for the incentives for energy audits. So there is some incentive funding in that program for that purpose. But the feedback we received early on, and I know I wasn't here, but Blake can address this, was that for the state-funded program, it would be more appropriate, considering our limited funding, to focus on planning and coaching and getting ready early for compliance, and then the 12 million would be spent on actual projects.
Right, and we are limited in what the CERTA funding can be spent on, and it needs to be spent on direct greenhouse gas reduction projects due to the nature of that funding, which is why we shifted the planning actions to the state funded portion to try to provide both. But yeah, it's a good comment.
We've got one more minute, and so I guess probably the best thing to do here is just take these questions in the chat and answer them and put them up on our website. So we'll do that. But if there are any other comments or questions from anyone, advisory committee members, anyone out there, you've got 1 minute. Anything?
I'll say thanks everyone for the great comments and for attending and continuing to be engaged in all.
Yes, and thank you all for joining. I put my email address in the chat. If you have any additional comments, please feel free to send those over. And again, all comments, suggestions are welcome, so please let us know. And we're at 12 o'clock, so thanks again for your time, and we'll conclude the meeting. Thanks.